Good evening and welcome back to Borderlines. I'm Fen, and tonight we're going to talk about water, money, and surrender. Because as it turns out this week, America paid for all three and only got one of them to work properly. Spoiler, it wasn't the surrender. Here's a question nobody in Washington seems to want to answer directly this week. How do you spend $15 million trying to make something look patriotic and end up with something that looks like a high school chemistry experiment gone wrong? That's not a rhetorical question. There's an actual answer, and it involves a felon, a trust fund, and a no-bid contract. And we're going to walk through it slowly because the details matter more than the punchline. But before we get to the pool, I want you to hold on to one idea because it's going to come back later in this video in a much bigger and much more expensive way. In this administration, the pattern is never the failure itself. It's what happens in the 30 seconds after the failure when someone has to explain why nobody competitive ever got a chance to bid on the job. Keep that in mind. We'll need it. So here's the setup. Back in April, the president announced a multi-million-dollar restoration of the Lincoln Memorial Reflecting Pool, the long, narrow pool on the National Mall that's been a postcard backdrop for Washington for almost a century. The plan was to drain it, fix the failing liner, recoat the basin in what was specifically described as American flag blue, and refill it just in time for the country's 250th anniversary celebrations. The original estimate for the work was around $1.8 million. That number is worth remembering because we are going to watch it move. By the time the work was finished in early June, federal contracting records show the total had ballooned to somewhere north of $15 million, more than 7 times the original estimate. And for about 24 hours, it actually looked good. Then the pool turned green. Not light green, not a tint. A thick, visible, algae-covered green that made international news within days, mostly because the contrast between announced and delivered is the kind of thing that writes its own headline. Now, to be fair to the administration here, because fairness matters in this format, algae blooms in this particular pool are not new. It's shallow. It sits in direct sun for most of the day, and the water barely moves. An aquatic ecologist at George Mason University, who actually sampled the water, identified the bloom as desmodesmos, a common non-toxic green algae that shows up in still water all over the region this time of year. So the algae itself isn't a conspiracy. It's biology doing what biology does in warm, shallow, stagnant water. What turns this from an unfortunate coincidence into a genuinely uncomfortable story is who got paid to prevent exactly this outcome, and how they got the job. The contract to install a permanent water purification system, the thing specifically meant to stop algae from taking over, was awarded without competitive bidding to an Ohio-based company called Green Water Services for $1.7 million. The Interior Department says it used an exemption normally reserved for urgent situations, citing the need to have the system ready in time for the anniversary celebrations. Here's the long-short version of why that matters. A no-bid contract isn't automatically corrupt. Sometimes there genuinely is only one vendor who can do something on a tight timeline, and the government is allowed to say so in writing, which it did here. But it does mean nobody else got the chance to compete on price, on technology, or on track record. No comparison, no leverage. Just one company selected directly. And that company turns out to be owned by something called the J.J. Cafaro Investment Trust, run by a man named John Cafaro, a longtime Republican donor who happens to be a neighbor of the president's at Mar-a-Lago, and who has given more than $300,000 to political committees connected to Trump since 2016. The Interior Department spokeswoman told the New York Times the company was selected because of its expertise, workforce, and materials, and that the White House had no involvement in choosing it. Worth sitting with that for a second. That statement confirms exactly one thing, that this is the official explanation. It tells us nothing about whether a competitive process might have produced a system that actually worked the first time. Those are two different questions, and only one of them got answered this week. Now here's where it gets almost too on the nose to be real, and I promise I'm not making this part up. The company's technology is called nanobubble filtration, ozone-infused microscopic bubbles designed to kill algae buildup inside the pool's underground pipes. According to Cafaro himself, in comments to a local Ohio paper, the system worked exactly as intended. It killed years of algae buildup, trapped inside those pipes, which then flushed out into the pool itself, where shallow water and direct sunlight let it bloom explosively before cleanup crews could catch up. Translation, in plain English, the treatment may have worked. The timing of when it was switched on, relative to when the pool was refilled and put on public display, did not. And separately, because this story has more than one moving part, a $13 million, later expanded to nearly $15 million no-bid contract for the actual blue waterproof coating on the pool floor went to a Virginia firm called Atlantic Industrial Coatings, sections of which reportedly began detaching and floating to the surface within weeks of completion. Two separate no-bid contracts, two separate sets of visible problems. One pool. Now, the president's response to all of this followed a pattern that, if you've watched any of these stories before, you'll recognize instantly. First, claim personal oversight. There's a widely circulated image of him at the pool inspecting the work, an image that, worth noting, multiple observers immediately flagged as carrying the unmistakable visual fingerprints of AI generation, not an actual photograph. Then, when the algae story wouldn't go away, pivot to blaming vandalism, the president posted that radical left lunatics had poured corrosive chemicals into the water, and that police were treating it as a vandalism case. Separately and unrelated to any of this, police did arrest 5 people for unrelated vandalism near the mall around the same time. But the scientific sampling, the actual water testing, identified ordinary seasonal algae, not chemical damage. 2 explanations, running in parallel, neither one canceling out the actual paper trail of how the contracts were awarded. So, why does a green pool deserve 12 minutes of your evening? Because it's a small, visible, easily verified test case for a pattern we're about to watch play out at a vastly larger scale, with vastly higher stakes, on the other side of the world, and the pool is useful precisely because you can see it. You can't see a uranium stockpile from a tour bus. Let's talk about Iran. While the cleanup crews were vacuuming algae off the National Mall, the actual headline story of the week was unfolding in Switzerland, where Vice President JD Vance traveled to represent the United States at follow-up talks on the new agreement between Washington and Tehran. And the optics, immediately, were not great. Video circulating from the Bergenstock Resort in Lucerne appeared to show Qatar's Prime Minister greeting Pakistan's Prime Minister and Army Chief with warm handshakes and embraces, while walking past Vance, who was left standing with his hand essentially unmet. Online, this got labeled instantly as a diplomatic snub, and it spread fast, the way anything humiliating looking spreads fast. In the interest of being fair here, because I think it's actually the more interesting read of the footage, the Qatari Prime Minister later posted a photo showing himself sitting directly next to Vance, working through documents together, with Jared Kushner in the frame as well, captioned simply, that work was continuing. So this may not have been a deliberate snub, so much as an awkward few seconds of video taken out of the flow of a long, technical, multi-party negotiating session, the kind that produces 1,000 small, unflattering frames if you're looking for them. What's harder to wave away is what Axios reported separately, that Iran's foreign minister was in the room and chose not to join the group statements or pose for any photo involving the American delegation at all. That's not a viral clip. That's a deliberate choice by the country on the other side of the negotiating table. And it tells you something about how Tehran currently perceives its own leverage going into the next round. Which brings us to the actual deal, the part of this story that matters far more than who shook whose hand in a hallway in Switzerland. In mid-June, the United States and Iran signed what's formally called the Islamabad Memorandum of Understanding, a 14-point framework mediated primarily by Pakistan that ends the active fighting between the two countries and opens a 60-day window to negotiate a final, comprehensive agreement. Let's go through what it actually says, point by point, because the gap between how this was sold and what's actually written down is the entire story. Point 1. Nuclear weapons. Iran reaffirms, again, that it will not pursue a nuclear weapon. This is the same commitment Iran made under the 2015 deal, the same commitment international monitors have spent a decade trying to verify, and as of this memorandum, there is still no agreed enforcement mechanism attached to it. A promise repeated is not the same as a promise enforced. Point 2. The existing stockpile. Iran currently holds an estimated 400 kilograms of uranium enriched close to weapons grade, material that survived last year's strikes, sitting under rubble at sites that were bombed. The memorandum does not require that material be removed from the country. Instead, both sides have agreed to a process called downblending, done on site, under IAEA supervision, essentially diluting the existing stockpile back down to a lower enrichment level inside Iran rather than shipping it out. Whether Iran keeps an enrichment capability going forward at all is explicitly left for the follow-up talks to decide. Now, slow down on that one, because in March of this year, Vice President Vance personally described the administration's core goal in these negotiations as Iran agreeing to, quote, an affirmative commitment that they will not seek a nuclear weapon, and they will not seek the tools that would enable them to quickly achieve one, end quote. That's not a casual aside, that was stated as the red line. Compare that to where the memorandum actually landed, a future enrichment capacity that's still on the table, pending negotiation with no removal of existing material required. Point 3, the missiles. And this is the part that should genuinely surprise you if you remember 2018. Go back to why the original Obama-era deal was scrapped in the first place. The first Trump administration's central argument for tearing up that agreement wasn't really about the nuclear material. It was that the JCPOA never addressed Iran's ballistic missile program at all, and that omission was treated repeatedly, publicly, as a fatal flaw. Fast forward to this month. The new memorandum text doesn't eliminate Iran's missile program either. The framework discusses limiting it going forward, but it does not require Iran to dismantle the capability it already has. The exact gap that sank the last deal is, by the administration's own current text, still open in this one. Point 4, and this is the one that should make any fiscally minded American sit up: the money. The memorandum commits the United States to help establish, with regional partners, a reconstruction and development fund of at least $300 billion for Iran. The administration has been careful to specify the American Treasury itself won't be writing that check directly. The expectation is that Gulf states fund the bulk of it. On top of that fund, Iran is set to recover a portion of its frozen overseas assets, separately estimated in the tens of billions. And as the agreement progresses, Iran would also resume freely exporting oil. A market analyst's estimate could be worth $60 to $70 billion a year on its own. And on sanctions. The memorandum explicitly commits the United States, in the final agreement, to remove what the text calls all types of sanctions, not just the nuclear-related measures, but also the sanctions tied to Iran's support for terrorism and human rights abuses. That is, on paper, a broader sanctions rollback than the 2015 deal ever offered. Now here's the long-short moment of the whole video, so sit with it for a second. In 2018, the first Trump administration withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal specifically because it was, in the president's own words at the time, the worst deal ever negotiated. A deal where, as he put it, we got nothing in exchange for unfreezing roughly $150 billion in Iranian assets and oil revenue. That was the entire justification for tearing it up. 7 years later, the replacement framework his own administration just signed includes a $300 billion reconstruction commitment, tens of billions in unfrozen assets, full oil exports resuming, a total sanctions rollback broader than before, no removal of the existing uranium stockpile, and no resolution on the missile program that supposedly justified walking away from the original deal in the first place. That's not a value judgment. That's just what's written on the page compared to what was written on the other page 7 years ago. You're free to decide for yourself whether that's a more dangerous regime being handled more cautiously after a costly war, or whether it's simply a more expensive version of the exact arrangement that was once called the single worst deal in American diplomatic history. Both readings are available. Only one of them was being said out loud this week, and on the actual mechanics of implementation, because policy lives or dies in the boring logistical details, not the press conference. Vice President Vance told reporters this past week that nuclear inspectors couldn't be reached when his team tried calling around 2 in the morning, an offhand comment treated as a joke in the room. It's worth pointing out plainly, after 4 months of active conflict, the absence of inspectors on the ground wasn't a surprise that materialized overnight. It's a basic operational requirement that needed lead time, coordination, and advanced scheduling, not a 2 a.m. phone call the night before. The gap between announcing a historic milestone and actually having inspectors physically back inside Iranian facilities is not a punchline. It's the entire substance of whether this deal can be verified at all. So, zoom out with me for a second, because that's really what this episode has been about. A $15 million pool, dressed up as a patriotic gesture for an anniversary celebration, handed out through no-bid contracts to politically connected donors that turned green within a day specifically because of the part of the process, competitive vetting, that got skipped in favor of speed. And a multi-billion-dollar geopolitical agreement dressed up as historic American leverage after a costly war that on its actual written terms surrenders more ground on enrichment, missiles, and sanctions than the deal it replaced, agreed to, in part, by an administration that spent 7 years calling the previous version the worst deal in history. Different scale, same root failure. When the process that's supposed to catch problems before they become public gets quietly skipped, whether that's competitive bidding on a pool contract or sustained technical negotiation on a nuclear file. What shows up later isn't a surprise. It's just delayed. The water tells you that within 24 hours. The missile program and the uranium stockpile will take a little longer to show their hand. That's FEN for Borderlines. Analysis from the edge. If you think this kind of detail is worth having, the channel's just getting started.